Hello, I'm President Mark Schlissel, and it's my honor to welcome you to the 30th Annual Davis, Markert, and Nickerson Academic Freedom Lecture. Before continuing, I want to extend a special recognition to Professor Chandler Davis, who's here with us today and inspires our community and nation to never forget the importance of upholding our highest academic values. I remember having the honor of meeting Professor Davis 5 years ago at the 25th annual lecture. So much has changed in our world since then that reinforces the importance of this lecture. I also express my appreciation to U of M's Faculty Senate and all members of our community who've worked to advance the ideals of academic and intellectual freedom. For 3 decades, this lecture and everything it stands for has been made exceedingly meaningful as a result of the work of so many people in our community. This year's lecture is certainly timely. As articulated in today's theme, the rapidly changing world is bringing with it tremendous challenges to our values and institutions. In the heat of the moment during a crisis, it can be difficult to slow down and listen, to consider the most essential values in decision-making, and hear multiple perspectives. I want to thank the 3 amazing thought leaders here for this year's lecture for their willingness to help us examine a highly uncertain world. As they've each demonstrated in their scholarship, the need to re-emphasize and reassert the concept of academic freedom remains ever so crucial in our society today. We live in an era where others seek to define the role of universities, not for the good of all, but for their own ends. Many even attempt to subvert the work that we do, along with the scholarly and scientific processes that produce knowledge and lead to conclusions. I believe that we all bear the responsibility for the constant vigilance required to defend academic freedom. It's my hope that the University of Michigan will forever serve as an inalienable forum for discovery, debate, and discussion, a place where respect and disagreement are complementary, where each makes the other stronger, and where we all advocate for and learn from their confluence. And I'm proud that for 30 years, the Davis, Markert, and Nickerson Academic Freedom Lecture has elevated the level of conversation and debate on our campus. The lecture also helps us to remember the mistakes of the past. This includes those made by this university when it sought to silence the scholars who are the lecture's namesake. In 1954, the year after the debut of Arthur Miller's The Crucible, the Red Scare came to Michigan. Professors Chandler Davis, Clement Markert, and Mark Nickerson were called to testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee. The 3 tenured U of M professors were questioned about their political sympathies and about those with whom they associated. All 3 refused to answer questions. But during the Red Scare, silence, along with the invoking of constitutional rights, was considered an admission of guilt. All 3 professors were immediately suspended by the university. A university investigation followed, and only Markert was reinstated. The administration fired Davis and Nickerson in what was a horrific mistake. As I said during the 2015 winter commencement, our university ignored both constitutional rights and long-held academic values. At a place like the University of Michigan, we must always continue learning. This includes questioning ourselves, our society, our decisions as leaders, and our role in the world, and working to ensure that universities remain true marketplaces of ideas. Thank you for engaging with us as we examine these issues, and thank you all for being champions of academic freedom. It's now my pleasure to introduce Colleen Conway, Chair of the Senate Advisory Committee on University Affairs and Professor of Music Education. Dr. Conway.
As you heard from the president, this lecture series is named after 3 faculty members. To honor those faculty members, in 1999, the Senate Assembly established the Davis Markert Nickerson Lecture on Academic Freedom. At the same meeting of the Senate Assembly, the Academic Freedom Lecture Fund was established, which became a 501c3 nonprofit organization tasked with fundraising for the event and related activities under the leadership of Assistant Research Scientist Emerita Peggy Hollinsworth, a former SACUA chair. Thanks to her leadership, this lecture has been a vibrant event for 3 decades. In 2018, a Senate Assembly committee was established, and they have been carrying forth this effort. On February 18, 1991, the first Davis Markert Nickerson Lecture was given by Robert M. O'Neill, General Counsel of the National American Association of University Professors, a professor of law and past president of the University of Virginia. The 3 professors were present then and participated in a panel discussion after the lecture. Since then, many distinguished individuals have served as DMN lecturers. To celebrate the 3 decades of DMN lectures, this year's event is a panel with 3, and it'll be moderated by U of M Associate Professor of History, Melanie Tennelian. Before I invite Chandler Davis to introduce our panelists today, I would like to take a moment to properly introduce him and share his personal perspective of the events of 1954. After completing his PhD at Harvard in 1950, Professor Davis joined the mathematics department faculty at the University of Michigan. Although all 3 of the professors for whom the lecture is named refused to answer questions about their left-wing political activities, Professors Nickerson and Markert cited the Fifth Amendment clause permitting a witness to refuse possible self-incrimination. Professor Davis, however, explicitly declined to invoke that protection. His purpose was that, if indicted for contempt of Congress, he could argue in the courts that the Un-American Committee's procedures were in violation of the First Amendment, making their sessions invalid, which could be defied with impunity. Professor Davis respected the position of his colleagues, Nickerson and Markert, and they respected his. However, Davis's plan to legalize the House on un-American activities proceedings was a long shot, plainly, and he was convicted of contempt of Congress. As a result, Davis served a 6-month sentence in federal prison. Most of Professor Davis's career since then was on the faculty at the University of Toronto, where he is now Professor Emeritus. Professor Davis has served the American Mathematical Society in several offices. In particular, he was for many years chair of the Committee on Human Rights on Mathematicians. Professor Davis is also a longtime member of the Association for Women in Mathematics, of which he is now a fellow, and notably the first fellow who identifies as male. Before I do that, I want to cover a couple of little logistics for the event. A link to the program has been shared in the chat for today. After our moderator and each of the panelists give some brief remarks, there will be a moderated discussion among the panelists. And after the discussion, there'll be an opportunity for anybody who's attending here to ask questions. If you wish to ask a question, please type your question in the Q&A, and Gary Krentz, who's the co-chair of the Senate Assembly DMN Committee, will monitor the Q&A, and he will forward your questions to the moderator. I'll just take a second to see if Chandler Davis is back. Any chances? All right, well, you have to love the Zoom version of things. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our moderator then. Please welcome Professor Melanie Tennelian. She is a U of M faculty member in the history department. She received her PhD in history from the University of California, Berkeley, where she studied under the guidance of Professor Bashara Doumani. Her research and teaching interests include the social and cultural history of World War I in the Middle East, the emergence of religious philanthropic societies and their work in times of conflict, the history of German missionaries, social Protestantism and modern humanitarianism, disease, medicine, and mental health. Her monograph, The Charity of War, Famine, Humanitarian Aid, and World War I in the Middle East, tells how the Ottoman home front grappled with total war and how it sought to mitigate starvation and sickness through relief activities. It examines the wartime famine's reverberations throughout the community, in Beirut's municipal institutions, in its philanthropic and religious organizations, in international agencies, and in the homes of its city residents. Please join me in welcoming our moderator, Professor Tennelian.
Welcome and good afternoon, everyone. I guess I'm filling some very big shoes as I'm stepping in to introduce our panelists. Of course, Professor Chandler Davis, who has disappeared on us. we'll blame the internet for this. Our three esteemed panelists for today are Nadje Al-Ali, who is the Robert Family Professor of International Studies, Professor of Anthropology and Middle East Studies at Brown University. And she has recently left her long-term position at the Center for Gender Studies at SOAS, University of London, to join Brown as the Robert Family Professor of International Studies and Professor of Anthropology and Middle East Studies. Her main research interests revolve around feminist activities and gendered mobilization, mainly with reference to Iraq, Egypt, Lebanon, Turkey, and the Kurdish political movement. Her publications include What Kind of Liberation? Women and the Occupation of Iraq, Women and War in the Middle East, Transnational Perspectives, Iraqi Women, Untold Stories of 1948 to the Present, and her co-edited book with Deborah Al-Najjar entitled We Are Iraqis, Aesthetics and Politics in the Time of War. Won the 2014 Arab American Book Prize for nonfiction. Our second speaker today will be Susan Benesch, faculty associate at Harvard and adjunct professor at the American University, as well as the director of the Dangerous Speech Project. Susan Benesch founded and directs the Dangerous Speech Project to study rhetoric that can inspire violence and to find ways to prevent this without infringing on freedom of expression. To that end, she and her colleagues conduct research on methods to diminish harmful speech online or the harm itself. She regularly voices related ideas on social media companies to improve both content moderation and user behavior. Trained as a human rights lawyer at Yale, Susan is a faculty associate at Harvard Berkman Klein Institute for Internet and Society, and she teaches at the American University's School of International Service. Among her recent scholarly publications are But Facebook's Not Country, How to Interpret Human Rights Law for Social Media Companies, and Proposals for Improved Regulation on Online Content. She also writes mainstream press articles, and in particular, she recently published an article, an op-ed, The Deadly Consequences of Trump's Gradual Insidious Rhetoric. And third, joining us is Michael Bérubé, Edwin Earl Sparks Professor of Literature at Pennsylvania State University. And he's the immediate past chair of the University Faculty Senate at that same university, having served as a chair in 2018 to 19. He's the author of 10 books to date, including Public Access, Literary Theory, and American Cultural Politics, Life as We Know It, A Father, a Family, and an Exceptional Child, and what's liberal about the liberal arts, classroom politics, and bias in higher education. I am very honored to be here and to share this virtual space with these esteemed scholars. And of course, the internet has thrown a little bit of a wrench into the procedures here, as I was not supposed to do this introduction, but we were hoping, of course, that Chandler Davis was going to do this for me. But I will begin by thanking, of course, and thanking all of you for being here on this snowy afternoon in Michigan. And I would like to specifically thank the Senate Assembly Organizing Committee for inviting me to moderate this discussion. A special thanks goes to Michael Atzmund, Gary Krantz, and Mary Jo Benesch, and the wonderful IT team behind the scene that is making this event possible, even with all the hiccups that we are encountering. I'm honored to be moderating the discussion considering the challenges of academic freedom in a changing landscape at home and abroad on the 30th anniversary of the annual Davis, Markert, and Nickerson Academic Freedom Lecture. It is a lecture that I've attended ever since I came to the University of Michigan in 2012, so this is a special treat. This panel discussion was initially scheduled for last fall with the intention that we would meet at the very moment when the Ann Arbor campus would be preparing for the presidential debate. But then we know that 2020 left little room for schedules and intentionalities. So here we are in a virtual space on Zoom a few months later. But I'm not saying anything new when I say that the American Academy has been the target of a systematic threat these last 4 years. We have witnessed and encountered numerous forms of intimidation, discreditation, investigations, and threats of defunding from powerful political offices, including, and perhaps most importantly, the office of the former US president. The anti-science attitudes, propaganda, and plethora of executive orders left little doubt that the White House was gunning, and yes, I'm purposely using this term here, for us, the Academy. While the Trump administration was not the first to be hostile to academia, it may have been the most extreme in our recent memory. My colleagues in the science saw the dismissal of their craft being taunted and flaunted publicly for all to see, research scorned, alternative facts invented from the stage of the White House briefing room. But it was not only our scientist colleagues who saw their profession questioned. The humanities and social science, although perhaps slightly less visible, too became the outright targets of the former administration in its attempt to silence the left and fueling what Colleen has called a climate of disagreement. There are many examples, but let me just raise two that for me as a historian in general and a historian of the Middle East in particular, not only struck too close to home for comfort, but also sounded the alarms of academic freedom coming once again under threat that moved well beyond the individual cases and started to resemble the McCarthyism of the 1950s. Let me begin with the former president's executive order to establish the 1776 Commission, which was to advise on how America's founding story should be taught in our schools. The 18-member commission, devoid of any US historian, instead made up of conservative activists, lawyers, politicians, was a clear affront to the discipline of history and intended to check academic freedom via a centralized approach to a nationalist curriculum. It was to ensure patriotic education, and in the words of the former president, I quote, clear away the twisted web of lies in our schools and classroom, and instead remind students that the American dream was equally available to everyone, something we know is of course not true. The administration's urged a return to a history that celebrated the supremacy of white men under the guise of a glorified foundation myth that professed equality. Besides the fact that a history of quote unquote great men is a variant of my discipline that's not only extremely unfashionable, it is also increasingly hard to justify to write such exclusionary story. However, besides disciplinary traditionalism, something else is at stake. When the former president, in referring to the peaceful Black Lives Matter protests, claimed that, I quote, the left-wing rioting and mayhem are a direct result of decades of left-wing indoctrination in our schools, unquote, it sounded a lot like the claim of the National Council for American Education when it thought, I quote, to eradicate socialism, communism, and all forms of Marxism from the schools and colleges of America, and to stimulate sound American education in the late 1940s. Well, as a historian, I will have to insist on contextual particularities. The similarities are haunting. But to my second example, a headline in the New York Times on September 19, 2019 read, the US orders Duke and the University of North Carolina to recast the tone of Middle East studies. The article was reporting on an investigation ordered by the Education Department under the leadership of Michigan's own Betsy DeVos, fueled by her civil rights chief, Kenneth Marcus, to investigate the improper use of Title VI money by the UNC Duke Consortium for Middle East Studies. The claims were, I quote, a startling lack of focus on geography, geopolitical issues, history, and language. Professor Henry Reichman, the chair of the AAUP, and also someone who has given the same lecture in 2019, described the department's inquiry as a chilling, inappropriate political intrusion into curricular decisions best made by faculty. But of course, curricular lack was not the only reason for the Department of Education's interference. In addition, the consortium was accused of sponsoring anti-Semitic events based on a definition that has increasingly conflated a critique of the state of Israel's occupation of Palestine with anti-Semitism. A conflation that I think we are familiar with here at U of M. I'm thinking here of the language that surrounded the case of a faculty citing their support for the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement as they refused to provide a reference letter for a student who thought to study at Tel Aviv University. Not only was that refusal following pressure from a number of directions, met with severe punishment of that faculty, some of it later rescinded, but also resulted in a warning to all faculty of their objective responsibility to their students, regardless of their own moral and political convictions. Both these examples are indication that external forces have few reservations in challenging and dictating what happens in our classrooms and how we engage with students outside of it. And you might want to refer to Joan Scott's 2017 article on free speech and academic freedom for a much more elaborate litany of extramural meddling and attempts of censorship. The election of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris might appease some of us, as the most visible and violently outspoken external threats are temporarily removed, and I am a pessimist here. And there's comfort, of course, in the reversal of policies. But looking at the long history of the University of Michigan, we know that encroachment and threat on academic freedom is not simply depending on who inhabits the White House. Instead, we ask, what are the broader changes in the landscape that will continue to pose challenges to academic freedom at home and abroad as we move forward? To begin with, we may speak of a growing influence of right-wing populism accompanied by a concerted assault on the academy that reaches well beyond the United States. And we may even say that in comparison, we have little to worry about. If we shift our gaze and view the European political landscape, it is clear that citizens of EU member countries are increasingly voting for parties on the extreme right, parties that have displayed a particular disdain for intellectual and scientific inquiry. Authoritarian regimes have made no secret of their intervention in the academy and the persecution of academics critical of their government. The question is, what is our role and responsibility to these colleagues in the international? But clearly, challenges to academic freedom are not limited to extramural intervention. Instead, there are more consistent challenges to academic freedom that move beyond one singular regime and are subject not only to changing politics, but also media technologies and, of course, the realities of a global pandemic. These challenges are linked to debates on the relation of academic freedom to First Amendment rights, the continued tension that reside in the political nature of the individual and the sham of a demand for objectivity, the impossibilities and possibilities of living and acting in a dichotomy of public and private, matters of dangerous speech and the importance of limiting such speech, and faculty governance as a measure of academic freedom within the institution's administrative hierarchies. And to help us think through some of these challenges today are three fantastic scholars whose work have been dedicated to the defense of free academic inquiry and instruction. And I would like now to invite each of our speakers to say a few words about their own work, and then I will raise some issues for discussion before we move into the Q&A session with the audience. And so I will introduce to you now into this virtual space, Nadje Al-Ali.
Thank you very much, Melanie, and thanks for inviting me to this discussion. It is an honor to be part of this panel. Now, personally, I find it impossible to think about academic freedom in the abstract, aside from a series of basic principles, of course, but I would argue that it is important to think about it in historically specific terms as well as in different cross-cultural contexts. And when we try to situate academic freedom in its specific context, we are ultimately forced to take a more holistic approach, both in terms of understanding its challenges, but also in terms of advocating for academic freedom. So if you look at academic freedom, for example, in the context of specific academic institutions, it becomes very soon obvious that it is closely linked to university governance. There's a clear connection between relative levels of academic freedom at any given institution and mechanisms for transparency and accountability within university administration. Are there collective mechanisms for decision-making and negotiating employment rights? Are there spaces to debate the university's vision and policies? The previous institution I worked at, prior to joining Brown, that was SOAS, the University of London, had a relatively good record of academic freedom. I certainly felt privileged during my time teaching there in comparison to my colleagues, not only colleagues in the Middle East, but actually also those in the US who are working in Middle East studies, which is a field that has long been under intense scrutiny, but particularly since 9/11. And during my time of working at SOAS, I never once felt that there was any sort of infringement on my academic freedom or the academic freedom of my colleagues. Now, retrospectively, I think a lot had to do with the fact that it was a highly unionized university with great levels of faculty and student mobilization and various forms of assuring transparency and collective decision-making. No doubt it is also important to contextualize academic freedom more broadly in terms of specific countries and given historical moments, and understand it in relation to relative levels of democratic mechanisms and processes, human rights, freedom of expression, but also, on the other hand, levels of political repression, authoritarianism, mechanisms of coercion by state and non-state actors, and this could include violence, arrests, and in some contexts, even killings. Now, UK-based academics in my field generally experience less restrictions and violations than their US counterparts, until higher education started to be more scrutinized a few years ago. The shift within British higher education relates to wider changes within the political landscape in Britain, but also globally. Here I'm thinking about the securitization of migration, borders and ideas, the growth of racism, Islamophobia, as well as the increase and normalization of right-wing voices, organizations, and movements. The next point I'd like to make is that I would challenge what is often made, this clear distinction that is often made between academic and what has been referred to as extramural activities. So for instance, my work for a long time, I was working on the impact of the US-led occupation on women and gender relations in Iraq post-2003. And it would have been absurd for me to only publish in peer-reviewed journals or to present at academic conferences. I was seeking out non-academic audiences and contexts in the form of various media, teach-ins, and public events. Now, although this work was not strictly academic, it was based on my academic knowledge, credibility, and the attempt to educate. In many countries, and I would say including the US, the idea of employing public intellectuals and engaged scholars seems to be something that institutions like to take pride in and also encourage in principle. However, while public intellectuals are showcased with pride by their respective institutions and also used as evidence that universities are not merely ivory towers, this does not necessarily translate into support and protection if we get attacked for our activities outside of campus. Now, my final point relates to the complexities and challenges of balancing academic freedom with the risk of harmful speech, hate speech, and even propaganda. I grew up in Germany where academic freedom was clearly valued. Yet I also grew up with the idea that more important, morally and politically, than academic freedom was the prevention of harmful speech. Now, in the German context, any material that is considered anti-constitutional, dangerous to the state, is not protected by freedom of speech and academic freedom. An example is the outright ban on material which supports Nazi ideas. Now, this clearly makes sense, and it made sense to me given not only Germany's specific history, but also the proliferation of harmful speech around the globe. However, I feel that in practice these days, it has tipped over and has become problematic. Nowadays in Germany, academic freedom seems to be severely curtailed by the equation, not only of the BDS movement with anti-Semitism, but even just talking about Palestine has become risky, as it is often being construed as anti-Semitic and hence anti-constitutional. Before I conclude, I would like to briefly mention Iraq, where I have family as well. Now, during the 35 years of Baath regime, academic freedom was virtually non-existent and contributed to a situation where the social sciences and the humanities were viewed with suspicion and were severely neglected. Yet, not only did faculty and students experience severe political repression, censorship, and the risk of arrest, torture, and execution, but the state also tried to use academics, writers, and artists for their specific propaganda and political purposes. Academics in Iraq were risking their lives to not be spokespeople for government propaganda and engage in harmful speech. And by the way, if any of you think that the situation has changed drastically post-invasion, you're mistaken. I'm happy to speak about this later on, maybe. So finally, I'd like to say that as we are joined in the struggle for academic freedom in different political and national contexts, we will have to negotiate the very principles that inform our respective conceptualizations and possibly recognize that there might be tensions and ambivalences in what we view as priorities in any given historical moment. These days, the political right is not only cracking down on academic freedom in different contexts, but has started simultaneously to become fierce advocates of freedom of speech, thereby not only engaging in aggressive anti-intellectualism, but also giving space and platforms to ideas and practices that are counter to principles of equality and justice. Thank you.
I will now invite Susan Benesch to give her opening remarks.
Thank you so much. I'm tremendously honored by the invitation to take part in this vital lecture series and want to express special thanks to the organizers for managing to make us feel as much as possible as if we have indeed visited Ann Arbor with or without snow. I'd like to start with a couple of provocations. First, I've read a University of Michigan description of academic freedom, and I'd like to define it a bit more broadly than to say that it is a right and a privilege enjoyed by professors. Academic campuses and institutions depend profoundly on students in many ways. Students often ask the questions that catalyze the best research, and one of the main enterprises of a university like yours is to turn students into professors. So the lines are somewhat blurred, which is a good thing in my view. Now, the second provocation, academic freedom overlaps quite a bit with freedom of speech, but in both cases, the freedom we're talking about isn't really freedom to speak. It's the opportunity to get other people to hear you or read you. It is, in the parlance of social media companies, freedom of reach, freedom to command the attention of other people, which is, as I'm sure you have heard, increasingly contested and scarce. You may, of course, have experienced this with respect to your own capacity to pay attention. Conflicts in these freedoms usually occur, of course, when one person wants to reach another person or people in a way that the would-be recipient rejects. Academia could not function without some of this, though. So the fundamental question for understanding academic freedom is which reach to permit and how to decide and who gets to decide. First Amendment, US First Amendment jurisprudence has generally answered such questions with what are called in the law time, place, and manner restrictions. For example, in US public discourse, which is what the First Amendment regulates, you may express your opinion, but not at 100 decibels outside my house at 3 o'clock in the morning. You may campaign against abortion, even by displaying gruesome photographs, and even outside a clinic where abortions are performed, but you must keep a specific distance from people who want to enter the clinic. Universities have experimented with this method of limiting expression by time, place, and manner restrictions to some extent, but they haven't been very successful so far for several reasons, including two that I want to mention here. First, a university campus has many buildings and corners and spaces, but it is also one place. So if something happens on a corner of campus, it still happens on that campus. If a speech is given anywhere on the campus, professors and students elsewhere may feel associated with it. Second, paradoxically, like any geographical place, a campus's borders are now blurred by online space, expression, and life. Professor Alali has mentioned her activity in what she was describing as not strictly academic speaking and publishing. And of course, many other professors and indeed students are also public intellectuals who and sometimes advocates who express themselves off campus, online or offline. Students and professors all speak and reach others online as well as offline, again, which complicates any efforts to regulate speech on a campus for that campus. In fact, efforts to regulate speech on US campuses seem to satisfy almost no one, and each controversy leads to new conflict. There are a few reasons for this also. I'll mention two. One is that after each speech controversy, often, groups of people on campus bifurcate quickly into two, one standing literally or metaphorically under a banner labeled freedom of speech, and the other standing literally or metaphorically under a banner entitled hate speech. But strangely enough, often the people standing under the freedom of speech banner do not really understand what that means, do not understand what the First Amendment regulates or how. And the people standing under the hate speech banner probably couldn't define it if you asked them. I should note that I couldn't define it very well either. There are many contradictory definitions of hate speech and no consensus definition in law or in common parlance. So that hate speech versus freedom of speech bifurcation is distracting and confusing and creates more conflict without solving much. The second reason why controversies regarding speech and freedom to speak on American campuses so often lead to conflict is that our First Amendment, of course, is of all the bodies of law in the world, the one that most vigorously protects freedom of speech. And yet some other bodies of American law restrict freedom of speech quite significantly, such as anti-discrimination and anti-harassment law in American workplaces. This leaves us with a often rather bewildering salad of rules and regulations pulling in opposite directions. I'd like to conclude by offering two ideas to make this easier. First of all, informal speech norms are vigorous in virtually any human group or society. They, in some cases, regulate speech much more than codified law. And they may be doing this more in the United States in general than in other places where law restricts speech more than our First Amendment law does. We all obey rules about what it is permissible to say without knowing it constantly. What we do very little of is to collectively declare those norms, I suggest doing this with one specific tool for that, and that is to focus on the harms that a group, whether it is students and a professor in a classroom or an entire university campus or indeed a country, focus on the harms that the group is attempting to prevent, and then reverse engineer, if you like, to decide which speech is likely to engender those harms. Though it is difficult to agree on which speech to permit and which to restrict, it is much easier to agree on which harms a group would like to prevent. I have taken this approach with my concept of dangerous speech, which I define as rhetoric or other forms of human expression that lower normal social barriers against intergroup violence. We have found in research, including on a number of campuses, that it's much easier to get people to agree that they would like to prevent serious intergroup violence than it is to get them to agree in the beginning on prohibiting certain forms of speech. With that, I'll stop and look forward to all of your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan. I'm now going to invite Michael Bérubé to join the virtual screen for us and continue with your opening remarks.
I'm glad I'm going last. Usually we're going in alphabetical order. Usually someone with BER leads off, but now I get the benefit of hearing Nadje's and Susan's remarks first. I don't want to reply to them right now because I think that's what discussion is for. I'll do my little spiel instead. I've completed a draft of a book with Jennifer Ruth of Portland State. And this is drawn from that manuscript. Theorists of academic freedom have no problem excluding certain ideas from serious debate. I think my précis mentioned the theory of phlogiston, the philosopher's stone, and the efficacy of human sacrifice. But we keep making exceptions for theories of racial hierarchy that are based on or derived from the pseudoscientific theories that dominated Western intellectual life from roughly 1850 to 1950 and produced the widespread advocacy of eugenics. And these theories persist today in mainstream social science flim-flammery about the superior virtues of European cultures. I'll be happy to say more about that. There have been a couple controversies about that in academia in the last couple of years. In our forthcoming book, Jennifer and I insist instead that a robust theory of academic freedom must be premised on the idea of equality. If we do not presume at the outset the equal dignity and value of all humans, we will inevitably create regimes of abstract freedom in which some people have to argue for their right to exist as equals as a precondition for arguing anything else. This is freedom on a steeply tilted playing field. It is the field all of us have inhabited all our lives, and those who benefit most from it, predictably, are the most susceptible to believing that the surface is level or only needs minor landscaping. Now, the field has long been tilted. One question we're trying to grapple with is like, why now? And I have 4 answers to that. I'll try to keep them brief. The first, there's now a shorthand, the Great Reckoning of 2020, the murder of George Floyd. But of course, that didn't occur in a vacuum. You could go back to the rise of Black Lives Matter 7 years earlier. You could go back to the murders of Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Freddie Gray, Walter Scott, Philando Castile in the same city in Minneapolis. And then, of course, in this year, more recently, Breonna Taylor, and literally too many more to name. But it has seemed finally to reach a crisis point, combined with the pandemic and the pandemic known as the Trump administration, to produce a sort of perfect storm for a reckoning. The second, which is not entirely unrelated, is the weaponization of free speech over the past 5-10 years and the rise of what some people are calling First Amendment Lochnerism in the courts. Lochnerism being a principle by which one constitutional principle is metastasized and applied to any number of things it wasn't supposed to be applied to. Now, the reason that's important is that in that debate between, say, free speech and hate speech, when critical race theory first got a toehold about 30 years ago, it was rebutted. I'm thinking here of a 2-part essay in The New Republic by Henry Louis Gates. Civil libertarians tended to say, look, in 1949, the ACLU argued in favor of racist Father Terminiello, and they argued in favor of a neo-Nazis' speech rights. And then winning that battle, they were able to use those free speech rights to defend the free speech rights of civil rights protesters in the 60s and 70s. Now that was undoubtedly true in 1993 when Gates was writing. It's sort of like a knockdown argument. See, fighting for fascists helps you eventually. And it was axiomatic for traditional civil rights advocates. It was in effect the rebuttal to one of the early arguments in CRT, Charles Lawrence III, who argued that it becomes difficult for us to believe that fighting to protect speech rights for racists will ensure our own speech rights, because our experience is that the American system of justice has never been symmetrical where race is concerned. That's Charles Lawrence. I wonder, though, whether the civil libertarian argument can still be made in the same way today, because over the last decade, the terrain of First Amendment jurisprudence has significantly been transformed by decisions like Citizens United in 2010, Hobby Lobby in 2014, and then most recently, Roman Catholic Diocese of Brooklyn versus Cuomo. There's been a similar case in California since then, that's 2020, arguing that the rights of religious groups to congregate in a pandemic supersedes anything else under the First Amendment, even supersedes public health considerations. So this has now decisively tilted First Amendment jurisprudence in the favor of corporations and religious conservatives, as the appointments to the court were meant to make it do, right? And also, as Ulrich Baer argues in a recent book called What Snowflakes Get Right, Baer argues that the 2017 Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville and the rise of groups like Identity Europa, the Three Percenters, the Oath Keepers, the Proud Boys, some of whom have been in the news lately for some reason, this phenomenon raises the question of whether the sell-by date of the traditional civil libertarian argument has in fact passed, and whether we might now consider that supporting free speech rights for Nazis is actually quite beneficial to Nazis and destructive of democracy to boot. There's another point in the book where we say, the traditional Justice Brandeis line that sunlight is the best disinfectant may not be true any longer. Sunlight may be helping things grow. Maybe bleach would be the best disinfectant. Third thing, what we've seen in academia over the last 10, 20 years, I think, is an increasing conflation of academic freedom with free speech. Jennifer and I are going to do some work to try to disentangle them, because academic freedom ultimately relies on a certain degree of scholarly expertise. Free speech does not. But what we're getting is the importation of an extreme libertarian position on free speech into a completely different domain that should properly rely on the idea of scholarly expertise instead, rather than on the idea that anyone can say anything they like. Thanks to that conflation, the weaponization of academic freedom now goes like this. The far right legitimates itself and wins the support of centrists and liberals by converting what is unambiguously racist speech into the grounds for the defense of the inviolability of academic freedom. If you don't defend faculty with racist views today, the argument goes, you won't be able to defend anti-racist faculty tomorrow. So it's again that civil libertarian argument we saw from 30 years ago, now imported to academic freedom. Fourth and last, the rise of social media. This is an enormous topic unto itself. Of course, I don't want to be heard as saying that social media are irredeemably evil. I participate in social media myself. But I will say this. Liberal theorists of democracy have not yet taken on the full implications of this development. We still cling to the wreckage of Habermasian beliefs about the public sphere, even those of us who are not Habermasians. These ideas originated in early 18th century coffee shops in England and evolved into systems of global mass communication that make it possible, in theory and largely in practice in the developed world, for anyone to contribute to public discourse. We imagined that this revolution in communications would be the equivalent and the enabler of the project of human emancipation that began with the Enlightenment, in which all humans would eventually be seen as free and equal, regardless of rank or station. Well, whatever you think about the Enlightenment, we have now learned that a global system of mass communications that connects 2 billion humans worldwide is not like a great big coffee shop in which people exchange reasoned ideas about the good life and the good society. It is more like an internet comet thread from hell, continually hijacked by trolls who have no interest whatsoever in reasoned ideas about anything. Social media have revealed decisively and irrevocably, we think, that not everyone at the table is operating in good faith. The so-called free marketplace of ideas, realized most fully in Facebook and sort of the intellectual counterpart to the extreme libertarian belief in the free market economy, it turns out not to be a seminar for the promotion of democracy, but a nearly anarchic free-for-all. I added nearly only because Twitter and Facebook finally did block Trump. after much agonizing, because those are the enormous concerns run largely by libertarian tech bros, and Jack Dorsey had to be leaned on heavily to make the decision he made. But it's almost an anarchic free-for-all that affords both sunlight and oxygen to the most noxious human ideas ever devised, and it leads directly to the circulation of elaborate perfervid fantasies about child abduction and molestation networks run by Democratic officials operating out of a Washington pizza parlor, and to the convocation of masses of tiki torch wielding white supremacists marching through the grounds of the University of Virginia, chanting "Jews will not replace us." Those then, I think, are the conditions of possibility for the rethinking, the reassessment of the parameters of academic freedom today. Now, how that reassessment would play out in practice is, of course, a subject unto itself. I assure you that our book does touch on that question of how this would actually be administered on campuses. And we also address the question of what we mean by white supremacism and how it is different from examples of ordinary racism and disingenuous complaints about cancel culture. But I think for now, I will leave these little matters for the discussion. And thanks again.
Thank you so very much, Michael. And I will invite all of you to now unmute your cameras and join me to go ahead with our discussion. Michael, can I ask you to come back?
Yes.
Here you are. I think we're all here. So thank you for your really great remarks, and of course, thank you all for the work that you do in all of your various spaces of activism, as well as, of course, in your roles as academics that are devoted and committed to the practice of academic freedom. Both Michael and Susan, you speak to this new landscape of social media, and I think we're all still kind of learning how to live with these layered complexities of instantaneous visibility of speech, and as Susan, of course, also points out, unprecedented reach. There's a duality here that I would like for us to think further, that Michael has pointed out, of course. But for example, John Wilson, who's a fellow at the University of California's National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement, writes that today one of the greatest threats to academic freedom is the attempt to silence professors by keeping them from using social media to communicate directly with the public. And I think this goes to Nadje's point of being both a public intellectual as well as a scholar. And Michael, you have, of course, written about the double standard when it comes to social media speech in the case of Stephen Saleda, who was unhired as a professor of American Indian Studies by the University of Illinois following objections from a series of tweets that were quite critical of Israel and Zionism. But at the same time, we have Hans-Jörg Tiede in his recent book about the AAUP write that academic freedom cases exist because they are reported in the press and causing negative publicity, of course, for the institutions that try to curb people's freedoms. And I'm also thinking of what kind of impact social media had in the case of my colleagues in Turkey, who in 2016 signed what is referred to as the Academics for Peace petition, calling for an end of the violence against Kurds in Southeast Anatolia. And I think, Nadje, you've also, of course, have experienced there. And as a result, had been criminally charged by the Turkish state for supporting terrorism. Human Rights and Academic Freedom Monitoring Group described this ongoing prosecution of the people who had signed the petition as an assault on their academic freedom and their freedom of expression and association. And I would say that social media there was not insignificant in raising international awareness and support, but at the same time, it also brings to the forth a question of what is responsible international solidarity. What may it look like? As such, attention we spoke yesterday about may also, of course, be quite volatile. So, can you talk a little bit about this duality that we are encountering, and Michael, you've of course touched on it.
Oh, I just spoke though. I'll hang back a bit and
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
So whoever
You want me
wants.
to have a first go? Yes, okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
So yeah, I've been thinking a lot about that in the context of the historical moment we find ourselves in. So there are lots of events that are commemorating the beginning of the uprisings in the Middle East and North Africa. And, you know, in the early days, you know, these were often called Facebook revolutions. And then you had the sort of discussion between the, you know, those celebrating social media and then the cyber skeptics. But it became apparent quite early on that, of course, the mobilization went beyond social media. But you know, the longer time went on, we also saw how authoritarian regimes were actually using social media to crack down, to control, and to engage in counter-revolutions. And you know, all the places, I mean, you know, just you mentioned Turkey. I mean, Turkey just recently passed a new social media law, actually last year, that gives the government sweeping new powers to regulate social media content. And this has disproportionate impact on academics because they were using social media as one of the few fora where they felt they could express themselves, because the media, the other media, print media, is very much controlled by the government. And you know, across the region, so I, you know, have been following carefully what's happening in Egypt. I mean, there are also academics now who are on Facebook, on Twitter, are being controlled, it's regulated. And of course, we know that often when it gets really bad, internet is just being taken down. So I think, as you say, it's doing both. I mean, it is still very much in the context of the Middle East. It's very much a platform for mobilization, for information exchange, and certainly in the context of the pandemic, it is a very important tool. But at the same time, authoritarian governments have certainly latched onto it and are using it as a control of as a tool for repression.
If I may tack back against some, I mean, my remarks, I was citing, though not by a direct quotation, Siva Vaidyanathan's most recent book, Anti-Social Media. You may know Siva's work, you know, shorthand motto that the problem with Facebook is Facebook. That no appointment of a group of archons to oversee it is going to solve the problem of having 2 billion people connected in such a fashion. I think he's right, and I think that that optimism that a lot of people in the West felt about the early moments of the so-called Arab Spring happening on Twitter, that quickly fizzled out. All that said, I was just trying to Google, I couldn't remember the name of the Central Park bird watcher. Both people involved in that incident were named Cooper. And I feel fairly safe to say that that young Black man would be in dire straits today if he had not had a phone. For that matter, what did it take to bring police brutality against unarmed Black citizens to consciousness? It goes back to the patrols of the South. It goes back nearly 400 years. Why does it take something like Michael Brown or George Floyd to penetrate the national consciousness in some way? Phones. I mean, I don't remember the officer who shot Walter Scott in the back 5 times as he was fleeing in Charleston, but without video evidence, there's no way that guy gets convicted. And to this day, he's the only officer in a prominent case who's been convicted. So there's something to be said. I still believe in the democratizing potential of a world in which everyone has a cell phone and everyone has a Twitter account or what have you. At the same time, that the potential for gross misuse and authoritarian crackdown remains palpable. And you know, when you think of countries where the internet is simply shut down, right? It's enough to make, it's in China, enough to make me think that, you know, well, we'll give a little bit of democracy a try again after all. For all its faults, at least, you know, it has an internet. But I don't think it's possible to read these things, like so many other technologies, as unidirectional. There is still the potential for resistance And again, I don't think a lot of the most recent Black Lives Matter protests could have happened without that sort of documentation, that video that you can't deny. Although I did not and cannot and will not watch the video of George Floyd himself.
Thank you, Susan.
I'm happy to pass on this one.
Mm-hmm.
I see that there are questions coming from the audience.
Yeah, would you talk a little bit about your dangerous speech project in terms of media control and social media?
Yes, I'd be happy to do that. I mentioned in my introductory remarks this idea. It's really an attempt to define or describe a category of human expression. It can be speech, but it could also refer to a photograph or even clothing of a particular color in context. It's any kind of expression that seems to lower normal human barriers. Of course, the term normal is very charged, but normal human barriers against intergroup violence. I came to describe that category by observing it. I was for some other research. I read a lot of what malevolent human leaders have told their own people in the months and years leading up to or preceding episodes of mass violence. And it is uncanny how similar it is from one case to another. So I thought it might be useful to define that, if nothing else, to develop a more sensitive form of early warning before atrocities and mass violence take place. But of course, my real hope is that one can find ways of interfering with the harm that this kind of expression brings about, in order to try to prevent or at least diminish mass violence. I emphasize the harm in part because, well, for a number of reasons, but the principal one is that I don't think it's enough to simply prohibit that kind of language or that kind of expression. And online, it's more or less impossible. You can't successfully stifle content online, even if you were to manage to take it down from a particular platform, which is very difficult, as all kinds of examples have shown us, like the appalling live streaming of the Christchurch massacre, for example. Facebook took down hundreds of thousands of examples of that video, and yet there were many more still up on the platform after that effort. And of course, it persisted in other places online. So in the vast majority of discussions about what to do about bad speech or bad content online, it's curious how terribly cabined and limited the discussion is in two senses. Number one, it usually focuses on only one possible response, which is what the companies call takedown, removing the content. And secondly, such policy conversations usually focus on only two possible actors. One, the companies themselves, and two, governments, which would act by pushing or forcing the companies to do certain things. And as Nadje has said, many of those governments have only the worst motivations for doing that and carry it out in terrible ways, like complete shutdowns of the internet in certain contexts. So I am convinced that for effective solutions that don't also impinge on freedom of expression, we must broaden the conversation from the point of view of tools and actors.
Thank you so much for these responses. I would like to pick up on a conversation that we actually had yesterday, and I thought that was a very fruitful conversation that I would like to raise in this forum as well. And then we'll go to audience questions. In our discussion yesterday, it's a discussion between faculty governance and academic freedom. Michael, you mentioned very poignantly that academic freedom is often understood as a negative freedom, a freedom from rather than a positive freedom, i.e. a freedom to. And the on-campus COVID crisis we experienced here last fall, which was largely the result of the administration ignoring faculty expertise and warnings of the dangers of in-person instruction and of students coming back to live on campus and around campus, ignoring calls for increased testing and more transparency, has highlighted the ability of the administration to really sidestep the mechanism of faculty governance. And even when the faculty voted to pass a non-confidence vote in President Schlissel last year, that both addressed the failures in handling the sort of campus public health safety, as well as the administration's blindness and non-transparency in dealing with the former provost Martin Filbert's decade-long history of sexual harassment and coercion, there was little to no consequence. Instead, the regents expressed their confidence in the president. And while, of course, if you look at the statement of UFM in terms of academic freedom, internal criticism is part of UM's definition of academic freedom. It is not often thought as such. And of course, President Schlissel has mentioned it himself in his opening remarks, the idea that internal criticism is important. I'm asking, I would like to get your feedback in terms of how and can we think of faculty governance more productively as yet another aspect of academic freedom, and how do we insist on it?
Should I start?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, that was kind of my opening, reflections, because I immediately, when I, now that I've been just moved to the States and sort of different academic institutions, clearly the wider political context matter, the specific country, the kind of discussions, the politics. But it just really struck me, moving from a highly unionized university in the UK to a private Ivy League university in the US, how the difference in governance has an impact on the way that transparency, accountability work or not work. And I mean, I'm so far, I've only been here for a little while, and so far I think I'm quite lucky in terms of where I am at Brown. But what for me is missing are the more collective mechanisms for discussing vision, for discussing policy, for negotiating employment rights. And so here, what I see is, very well-meaning, nice administrators, but I'm wondering if they're not so nice and well-meaning, what would happen then, right? Mm-hmm. So a lot sort of hinges on, relationships and, cordial relationships and people having, well, seemingly good politics and values, but there are no mechanisms to protect any of us if, there would be people, with different kinds of politics or, who wouldn't be so nice and kind. So I really, the more I think about it, the more I think that, those more collective. So I'm thinking about unions, I'm thinking about, senates, and, really very down to earth mechanisms and processes that allow for not just rubber stamping decisions, but, proper engagement in processes of decision making. And then also, very importantly, proper processes for grievances. I think that is so important. Again, what do we do in institutions when things go wrong? What are the processes in place there? And I was actually for a few years, I was the equality and diversity officers within the union, and then I became president of the University College Union at my university. And so I saw a lot how, these processes and the very mechanisms were so key and sometimes things went wrong, but they're very key in addressing or in sort of pushing back the kind of dependency on just personnel specific, characters in the administration.
Can I add to that? Now, I'm also glad that Nadje mentioned that in her opening remarks and sent me scurrying to, let me back up a moment. Everyone knows that the academic freedom in the US, as enunciated in the 1940 Statement of Principles of the AAUP, covers research, teaching, and extramural speech. And I used to say that extramural speech is like the Holy Spirit in the Christian Trinity, the most mysterious of the three. And the analogy breaks down because there is a fourth element, and it's shared governance, except that it's not in the 1940 statement, and the AUP never issued a statement on it until 1994. And I'm going to quote from that statement, that academic freedom includes the freedom of faculty to express views, quote, on matters having to do with their institution and its policies, and that, close quote, and that with regard to institutional matters, quote, grounds for thinking an institutional policy desirable or undesirable must be heard and assessed if the community is to have confidence that its policies are appropriate, close quote, apply to COVID as you see fit. But I incorporated that into an essay I wrote that was published late last year, called What I Learned in the Faculty Senate. Because what I learned in the Faculty Senate was that I had always thought of academic freedom, as Melanie, as you attributed to my saying that it was a negative freedom, it was a freedom from. It was a freedom from interference by administration, by legislators, trustees, journalists, parents, passersby, and so forth. And that it was built on a foundation of scholarly expertise. But the idea that it also entails governance, I did go back into, I neglected to do this yesterday. So between then and now, I looked into Michigan's academic freedom policy, and you do indeed have a fourth clause in there regarding internal freedom, freedom to comment on internal matters. Now, I didn't think when I got a PhD that I would eventually have to butt heads with risk management. There's a less funny version of this. When Richard Spencer was asked to speak at Penn State and we denied him that right, I immediately thought of what had happened at Charlottesville. And one of the things that Terry Sullivan, UVA president, did not do was invoke a policy forbidding open flames on campus, right? No one gets a PhD in the humanities to research open flames policy on a campus, but here we are, right? And so that became part of my advice to administration. We have an open flames policy. We don't want to make that same mistake. To risk management, I found when I came in that they had simply dropped a policy forbidding the families of faculty members from accompanying faculty members on courses abroad, citing risk, because apparently this is too distracting and faculty have to serve in loco parentis for students traveling abroad 24/7. And what was astonishing about that is that no one in risk management even thought that they had to consult with faculty about this. It was simply their job to assess risk and to manage it. And it took us about 3-4 years to make any inroads on that. The first couple of meetings, they simply told us what the policy was and why they had enacted it. So I found that first immensely frustrating, but also when I go back to that 1994 statement from the AAUP, expressing views on matters having to do with their institution and its policies, that's really quite broad. And I find very few faculty know about it or take it seriously, partly because you're dealing with all kinds of disincentives. Not only is there no incentive to learn about risk management or open flames policies, but also service itself is the most devalued of faculty activities. So, and this is in a corner of the basement of service, right? So, yeah, it really, I mentioned this yesterday, my shorthand for this is if you understand why academic freedom is important, you already own at least one NPR tote bag. But if you understand why shared governance should be part of academic freedom, you're almost certainly on the Faculty Senate or some other body. But I think it's important to note here that when we talk about the neoliberalization of the university, we usually mean the defunding, the withdrawal of public funding from all publicly funded things and the recalibration of public goods as private interests best served by the free market. But what's also happened in the last 30 so years is the growth of all manner of other offices at the university that faculty never thought they had to speak to, and certainly think they never have to speak to faculty.
Susan, would you like to add?
Not on this one. Michael is a tremendous expert on university governance and has made so many good points. I'll just.
Yeah, it's a really interesting discussion, and to think about, and to really also take this serious, right? I mean, it is in the statement of the university that is part of our academic freedom, and to work within that is of course admirable, and to insist on it, of course, and to work within these mechanisms that are available to us to make our voices heard. I would now like to invite Chandler to unmute his camera and say hello, if that's possible. Chandler, also unmute your microphone, please. Yes, wonderful.
I think I'm back on screen. Sorry, I dropped off before. It wasn't malicious. I'm in a strange position because I've been listening to people give these lectures for 30 years now. And is there anything new to say about academic freedom? Well, of course there is. And it's not only the fact that the situation has changed, but people make progress in dealing with it. And I'm looking forward to reading Susan Benesch's notes for the Dangerous Speech Project. I think she has new ideas. And one of the things that we have encountered in recent years, as panelists have said, is recognizing de facto limitations on speech and dealing with the real limitations, not just the statutory ones. And when there are statutory limitations, the thing that's most often emphasized is hate speech. Various jurisdictions forbid you to make certain kinds of slurs. And that's also true of the unofficial limitations. But there's another kind of thing that we have to watch out for even more these days, which is assertion of things that are definitely false, that are known to be false, and for which no effort is made to pretend that they are true. Robert Proctor likes to use the word agnotology for the deliberate dissemination of falsehood. There are two kinds of deliberate circulation of falsehood. There's attempts to persuade people that the false statement is true, and there are attempts to persuade people that it doesn't matter that it's not true. Now, the deliberate propagation of falsehood is not new to the attack on academic freedom. When Senator Joseph McCarthy, who was wrongly regarded as the leader of the Red Hunt way back in the day, waved a sheaf of papers and said he had the names of 200 card-carrying communists in the State Department or the military, whatever it was. I think most people knew he didn't really have 200 names then. And was he attempting to get people to believe it or not? I don't know. But that kind of thing is so much more common now. It must take a larger portion of our attention than at any time in the past. The habitual lying of the last 4 years has become so common that people are inured to it. And I hope that our future efforts can address that.
One quick note, may I just do a PS, because I teach at Penn State, which you may not know is the world center of agnotology. Robert Proctor and Londa Schreibinger developed the concept here 20 years ago before they left for Berkeley. And now we're at the world center in a different way because we have the climate scientist Michael Mann, who's sort of the epicenter of, Michael, one of his recent work is about this. There's another aspect to agnotology, the production of ignorance, is just the sowing of needless doubt. And that's what the tobacco companies sought to do, decades ago, and then employed the same people to question climate change today. That's basically Michael Mann's argument, and he's right. My argument so far had to do with white nationalism and white supremacism, but there are aspects of our book that touch on the question of fitness more broadly. And the most recent examples, to go right to Chandler's point, would be Scott Atlas at Stanford, who was briefly Trump's science advisor for the last 6 months, deliberately spreading misinformation about the pandemic, deliberately spreading misinformation about social distancing and now about vaccines. And then very late, as a footnote, the law professor John Eastman showing up at the insurrection on January 6th and then blaming Antifa for the riot that resulted. Both of those things, both Scott Atlas and John Eastman, I believe, are trafficking in falsehoods so egregious and so deliberate as to raise the question of their fitness to serve in any capacity in any university worthy of the name.
If I may interject with a question, what would you do, Michael, about that? About academics who spread lies?
Well, I'm going to try to resist the temptation to adjudicate all things, even though I would do so justly and fairly. And in fact, in the course of writing the book, Jennifer and I had to hold off on, there's certain we don't know the full parameters, we don't know all the circumstances. But what we propose is something that got widely ridiculed last year because it got widely ridiculed largely because people outside academia don't know how things operate. And it was the aspect of the Princeton letter, where Princeton, about 350, 400 Princeton faculty signed a letter in support of various anti-racist initiatives, the most controversial of which was a faculty committee to investigate charges of racist research and statements. Now, it sounded to a lot of people, especially Connor Friedersdorf in the Atlantic, like the Star Chamber had finally arrived, right? This would be the new McCarthyism. This would be the nightmare scenario of cancel culture. And Jennifer, who is the VP for Grievances and Academic Freedom at Portland State, came back and said, no one realizes we already have mechanisms for this. They're just not at least bit accountable. And one of the things we were told about Michigan is that the Office of Institutional Equity investigates faculty misconduct and there's no right to appeal the findings. There's no faculty involvement at all. This goes back to my earlier point about the offices that have grown up around the university that don't answer to faculty and which faculty have almost no communication. So this would be a jury of their peers, basically. I actually think that the jury of their peers, either for John Eastman or for Scott Atlas, or for that matter, for Amy Wax at Pennsylvania, Bruce Gilley at Portland State, it's up to them to determine whether whether academic freedom covers the kinds of statements they have made. And it gets especially problematic, to go back to Nadje's opening remarks. We've dwelt already on the paradox that when professors speak as citizens, they have less protection when they speak from a position of expertise than if they speak as random cranks. If I go off on Twitter tomorrow about high-speed rail, that's all right, I already have, I did it yesterday, I'm in favor. And I think the Cato Institute's arguments against them are just ridiculously stupid. But no one cares what I think about high-speed rail. I am not an expert in transportation. However, if I'm a historian who denies the Holocaust, I'm probably unfit to be a historian, right? So it gets very tricky to determine when someone is leveraging his or her own scholarly expertise the way Scott Atlas was in science, in epidemiology, even though he's not an epidemiologist, and John Eastman, an actual constitutional law professor, arguing for an insurrection and then blaming it on Antifa. That's really damaging. I would turn that over to an elected jury of their peers. I wouldn't presume to adjudicate those things myself.
So this brings me to then ask if you are, for example, a Holocaust denier, and we of course know a very prominent case in the Midwest, but you are an economist, what are the responsibilities there? You are openly speaking about that issue, but then of course it's not necessarily your subject that you're teaching, and so this person of course has been teaching for many years and will continue probably. And then on the other hand, of course, how to deal with the sort of white supremacist narratives that are coming to campus that are not necessarily faculty or professors, but are the likes of Richard Spencer, where of course at U of M we had our own encounter with Richard Spencer a few years ago, where he asked to rent a space and calling, of course, citing the First Amendment and free speech as the platform for him to be able to rent a space at a public university. And whereas Michigan State University said, no, you can't, but then was forced into a lawsuit to accommodate him, our administration decided that they would, of course, that they would have conversations with Spencer and his team. At the same time, the actual event never took place, but there's this sort of open-endedness that he could potentially come back and ask for this, and there's an agreement. So just to put these two kind of cases on the table as well, how would you deal with those?
I think I would ask the dangerous speech person first.
I first of all, I'm thinking about the ambits in which speech is made. The Holocaust denier, I take it, is not making those statements in the classroom while teaching economics. Is that right? But
one would assume so, yes.
Well, I don't know, but so for the sake of discussing specifics, I'll assume that such a person is making statements in the public sphere, outside the confines of a university, which, as I mentioned, are no longer really confines, but at least there's some sort of a fuzzy boundary. I much as I have every reason to be disgusted and frightened by Holocaust denial, I'd be terribly worried about a university attempting to censor someone for their comments outside, particularly outside their job, outside the campus. I can only, because I can think of so many other kinds of speech that that other professors and other people on a campus would disapprove of and might want to stop. I noted also that one of the questions from the audience begins, I am a liberal, but I'm worried about too much circumscribing, pardon me, of speech, lest we end up with, only relatively narrow boundaries of what it is acceptable to say or not say. And then, of course, I think of the examples that led to the existence of this lecture series. Those are, examples of people who were accused of having views or speaking opinions that were disfavored by people in power at the time. Of course, I'm not nearly as worried about those opinions as about white supremacy or Holocaust denial. But the problem is, unless we have some kind of a, as I said, in my introduction, the problem is, how will you decide And who will decide? Once you accept that a university's governance processes will in some way punish someone, like a professor, for what they are saying outside the university.
One quick note on that. This is not a
Let me
hypothetical.
comment.
Arthur Butts at and Professor Emeritus at Northwestern was a professor of electrical engineering. He's also the author of the book, The Hoax of the 20th Century, Holocaust Denial. There's no evidence that his Holocaust denial affected his electrical engineering in any way, or his classes, or his relations to students. He was just a crank on the street corner with a soapbox. And as odious as that is, he is fully protected by the First Amendment. And Northwestern can just keep issuing disavowals and saying there's nothing to do with his scholarly expertise. The problem comes when the lines are blurrier, with a case like Scott Atlas or John Eastman. I also want to address the question that came from the presumption that a world ruled by Mao and Stalin would not be a good place for human flourishing, and how our arguments would play out. Because I want to go back over terrain that Chandler, I'm sure, knows better than I do, but I did review the 1956 report of the AUP on the McCarthyist era. And the problem with McCarthyism is that it too was inimical to the free society. It was a totalitarian response to totalitarianism. I say this agreeing that the world ruled by Mao and Stalin is not the one I want to live in. But they set the bar so low that even invoking the Fifth Amendment or refusing to sign a loyalty oath was grounds for termination. And the grounds of the AUP said, active, conscious participation in conspiracy, yeah, you're probably unfit. If you're deliberately trying to undermine the American government in your research and your teaching, that's one thing. But the number of people who are trying to do that is vanishingly small. And the number of people who were fellow travelers or simply sympathetic to left causes or simply skeptical of reports of what was coming out of the Soviet Union, that's a much larger group, and they were targeted. So I think with the analogy, if we take it to white supremacism, the bar has to be very, very high. Opposition to affirmative action or immigration doesn't cut it. That's ordinary, bog standard conservative thought. Likewise, conservative thought that argues for less regulation in government and less taxation, I have no problem with that. That's part of ordinary human discourse. Belief in the inherent supremacy of one group of people over another, no, not so much. But I want to keep that bar high. Otherwise, live in the world we already live in, where people are suspended for quoting the N-word in a passage by James Baldwin, or by using a Chinese term that sounds like it. We've already got that. We've got the bar set incredibly low, and with sometimes no due process or appeal whatsoever for administrative decisions made about that. Some people, again, thought the Princeton proposal was draconian. It is so much better than what we have now, I can't tell you, right? Right now, we have an administrative system that is not answerable at all to any of these questions.
Michael, I don't think that the Red Hunt was a response to Stalin's tyranny. I think that's it purported to be. It was not a response to Stalin's tyranny. It was a program of repression of a whole spectrum of ideas. And it was conducted in an illiberal way throughout. But to go back to what you've been saying and what Susan been saying, yes, when we're dealing within the community, we need procedures within the community. We have them. We deny tenure. We deny employment to intellectuals whose intellectual production we consider inferior, and if they make a profession of propagating things we think are false, then we don't reward that with a position at a university, and that's not the question. Many years ago, long before there was a series on academic freedom at the University of Michigan, maybe before Peggy Hollingsworth was born. I made this distinction between those of us who were attacked as professional dissenters and those of us who were attacked as amateur dissenters. I didn't get my job at Michigan by expressing my support for socialism. That I did in my spare time. So I was attacked pretty vigorously, but it was for my off-campus advocacy. Things that are done as part of my profession should also be protected, but they're protected in a different way, and they're protected under different criteria. I think it's important to preserve free speech, and it's important also to have such a thing as professional standards.
Thank you so much, leading us right into an audience question that came into me here in the chat. So the audience member asked, during the McCarthy era, there were many abuses of academic freedom undertaken in the name of national security. So taking this now to the contemporary moment, today, government agencies are pursuing investigations into many universities focused on faculty with certain ethnic backgrounds. What's the impact on these contemporary attacks on academic freedom in the name of national security? And I think, Nadje, you might have something to say on this issue.
Yeah, so I'll give you an example from my experience in the UK, where I said that for a long time I felt quite privileged doing Middle East studies in comparison to my colleagues in the US, who I think for a much longer time, and particularly since 9/11, had been under intense scrutiny and experiencing many more infringements on their academic freedom. But things started to change in the UK in the context of anti-terrorism legislation and sort of an increased attention to security. And so in 2015, the British government introduced what was called the prevent duty. And the idea was to prevent radicalization on campus and through education. It turned out that the university that I was teaching at, that is SOAS, which stands for School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London, was the highest on the list when there was sort of an assessment of infringements on or violations of the prevent agenda. Now, when you actually looked at the instances, these were events organized by the Muslim Student Society, or these were events on Palestine, right? So it was very clear that the way that the prevent agenda worked since 2015, not just at SOAS, but across the country, was disproportionately targeting Muslims and events linked to Palestine and more specifically BDS. However, other issues around sort of nationalism, racism, transphobia, homophobia were not only not targeted by the prevent agenda, but simultaneously the British government engaged in these sort of guidance and legislation that there should be free speech. So again, you see this, double standard. And of course, here in the US, I would say that again, Muslims and anyone working on Palestine or critical of Israel has been particularly targeted.
I don't know whether I'm talking out of school here, but very briefly, I can hear in that question certain concerns I've been hearing in recent years about China, about Chinese scholars and exchanges with Chinese scholars, whether it's visiting scholars or as American scholars working in China, with regard to information technology, export controls, national security. And I worry that they too are being surveilled and targeted for that reason. I mean, Chinese scholars.
I'd like to jump in and focus on the the justification of national security as a reason for investigating academics, or doing all kinds of other harmful things. It's very powerful for two reasons. One is a threat to national security suggests to people that they have something to fear, that there is a significant collective threat by another group of people inside a country or outside a country or both. That was the case, obviously, for the Red Scare, and it's also the case now, and was the case during the Trump administration. All kinds of terrible policies, from separating children from their parents at the border, for example, to many others, were justified with this terribly strong cudgel of national security. It's frightening, and it also comes with a sort of a built-in justification of secrecy. We can't tell you the details, it's secret, it's classified, but trust us, this is terribly dangerous. You have to, let us do what is necessary in order to protect the nation. It's a song we have unfortunately heard many times before. That's not to say that there's no such thing as an authentic national security threat, but the minute a government begins to identify professors as the source of a national security threat, obviously, this is the last audience to which one has to explain that. But I think it's important to point that out. And we have used the term hate speech many times. It's difficult to have any discourse about freedom of speech without that term hate speech slipping in. From my own work, I don't think that hate is really the operative emotion. It is fear, and particularly fear when framed around a threat.
This is actually, it's interesting that you're mentioning this. If we think of the sort of long history of the University of Michigan, this idea of national security leads us back to 1917 with the Sedition Act during World War I and the anti-German sentiments, which in the context of that scare and that fear, a faculty member here at the University of Michigan was also dismissed by the regents in that context, and became part of this sort of national security fear mongering that came out from the White House and made its way to the university. So it's has a long history that resonates, I think, with campus history as well. I want
the 1956 AAUP report. I should have mentioned its title because it kind of makes Susan's point. It's called Academic Freedom and Tenure in the Quest for National Security. So it helps the framing, right?
Yeah.
You're going to really have to go a long way to tell me that any of the professors investigated in the Red Scare were a threat to national security. But that's even the AAUP report condemning it accepted that framework.
Yeah.
Let me just add that being a professor doesn't prove you're not a threat to national security. I think Henry Kissinger was a professor, and I think he was a very great threat to world security. And but you deal with it in terms of the threat. You don't say that that a Chinese visitor is a threat to national security because he's Chinese and you'd like to keep the Chinese from competing. But you deal with it in the same way you would deal if it were not a professor.
I think we have time for one more audience question that keeps us in the international. And it's Michael Kennedy who writes, most of the discussion has been about academic freedom within constituency, whether in the faculty senate or of a given university or within the nation whose academic associations are national. While national and the university context may vary, there's also a growing evidence of transnational solidarity, and something that Nadje also has mentioned, whether in defense of universities in exile, Central European University, European Humanities University, of scholars at risks, or of universities under attack. Most obviously, of course, the recent event at Bozaji University, where Erdogan appointed an AKP affiliate outside of what would be normal university procedures. What are the most effective methods, Michael is asking, that you have found in supporting academic freedom in these transnational terms? And what are the most troubling contradictions in its defense? Oh, that's a good question.
I'm happy to have a first go. Thank you, Michael. I think it's a really important question. And I mean, especially right now, we know that as we speak, you know, students and faculty are being arrested in the streets of Istanbul, and of course, many other places around the world. And the issue of transnational solidarity, we discussed it a little bit yesterday when we had a sort of informal discussion amongst ourselves. It's a really tricky one. Of course, many of us, I think, have been signing petitions. I certainly signed petitions in support of our colleagues in Turkey who, you know, by the thousands have been made redundant, lost their positions, had their passports confiscated, many of them also arrested, you know, some in prison. But, you know, in some contexts, when I think about, for example, Egypt, and we also talked about Iran yesterday, in some contexts, transnational solidarity, that is, you know, forms of consciousness raising, petition writing, might actually backfire and might make things worse for academics or, you know, other people. So that is really tricky. I mean, one of the things that I think that aside from, you know, always balancing this, and I guess I always ask my colleagues in the countries, you know, what they want us to do. I think that's really important. And I'm not saying that everyone would want the same thing. You know, people are diverse. So, you know, people would want to propose different strategies, but I guess I would talk to the people that, you know, I trust, and I would, you know, ask them to, you know, take a lead in suggesting this. But aside from obviously sort of transnational solidarity in terms of raising awareness, what is happening, and trying to lobby governments in the respective countries, I think one of the things that we can do is to support academics at risk. So while I was in the UK, I was very much involved with an organization called CARA, which started during World War II and in the UK as a way to support academic refugees from Germany, from Nazi Germany. But it really became very active again following the invasion of in Iraq in 2003, where Iraqi academics were targeted specifically, and, you know, hundreds were killed, and many ended up in the UK. And the equivalent of CARA in the UK is the Scholars at Risk and the Scholars Refugee Rescue Fund here in the US, which is trying to host academic at risk, those who have managed to get outside, but also to work with academics inside and sort of try to, you know, provide resources. So I think that's another important thing that we can do, is to provide spaces for scholars who have managed to get outside or seeking respite, you know, at least for a short time.
We have one more question from the audience. Thank you, Nadje, for that insightful comment. It's always tricky to figure out what is the balance that one will strike in these international engagements, and you insisting on having conversations with colleagues on the other side and asking their input as to what they need, and then moving from there, I think, is something that is definitely well perceived and heard. So there's another question that I'm getting from Gary on the other side, and he is posing a question or sending me a question from an audience member that says, there has been little discussion of threats to academic freedom from within the academy. An example of a potential threat is demands from internal stakeholders, i.e. some students or faculty, for content to be added, removed to curricular material. So this goes to teaching. At this is happening. In some places on this and other campuses, administrators are attempting to implement such curricular changes and have at least implied to stakeholders that they will be able to do so. I'd be interested in any reaction from the panel about threats to teaching autonomy.
Anyone wants to start? Or? I mean, I've just before this meeting, I'm co-chairing the Diversity Inclusion Committee of the Watson Institute. I'm co-chairing this, and I actually, so I guess, you know, for me, I do feel that we need to balance academic freedom with other values, and I guess so maybe that's my German upbringing. But I guess, you know, I also stopped my statement by saying, you know, values of justice and equality are very important. And so I think that if we are serious about issues in terms of, you know, education to address issues around racism, sexism, homophobia, I think it is a problem that, you know, we're still teaching all kinds of issues without taking into consideration the voices and knowledge production by people who are not white men, right? And so, you know, if we are serious about diversifying our epistemologies, if we are serious about challenging racism and sexism, we have to diversify. And, you know, no one should be forced. I mean, this is not about forcing people. No one should be punished. But I do think that people should be strongly encouraged and, you know, participate in discussions. And clearly, you know, this is not only what increasingly students are demanding. And I don't think we should have to respond to every whim of what, you know, students are demanding. But I do think that it's definitely worth a discussion. And, you know, it is a matter of balancing, you know, it's not about imposition and control. But I have had colleagues who reacted badly when I asked them if they had, in response to, you know, Black Lives Matter in the summer and also response to decolonizing calls, if they had revised the syllabi and if they would be willing to share. I got very, you know, a few sort of quite aggressive responses. And I think it is sad that, you know, this is misconstrued as a violation of academic freedom.
Chiming in to say what Nadje just said. There are a couple of examples literally within arm's reach here that I could that I am pointing to. But I want to preface that agreement by saying this is a trickier matter than a lot of people tend to think it is, because there are pedagogical contexts. I'm thinking of large introductory classes in many sections, for example, where a department can stipulate a common textbook or a general approach or whatever, whether it's calculus or composition. And that does place some restrictions on the individual instructor's right to choose materials. And this was presented to the AAP about 20 years ago, and it was clear that no one had really thought about that. We were always thinking of the single instructor classroom and the right to determine the content of the syllabus freely. But so that was one thing. It was first the question of how to balance that with a, say, there's another parameter here for things that involve, say, in nursing, credentializing, accreditation, and making sure that your graduates are credentialed to pass the boards and whatever. So there are parameters there on what can be taught and in what way. But the real thing these days is that we're dealing with, again, I'm thinking of two examples already at hand, of people who went ahead with graduate seminars in American literature and culture without a single non-white figure in them. And I'm looking at my watch and the decade hand has moved. And I don't see any, I go back, I did graduate work in the 80s. So I actually remember dimly a time when people had to make the case that Frederick Douglass was legitimate material for American literature, where the slave narrative was considered not really literature, a compromised form, but those arguments are now 40 years old. And the people who argued against them lost pretty decisively. And the idea that we'd have to make a case in CE 2021 to have a few Black writers in a course, say, in American literature and culture is just jaw-dropping to me. And it is making some of my younger colleagues question whether that idea of academic freedom isn't, in fact, an impediment to a broader sense of responsibility to the archive of American literature and culture.
Just a question, what would happen if you required professors to post their syllabi before classes begin so that as students choose courses, they can see the syllabi?
We could hear the screaming from here. No, I don't, that may be too cynical. But, you know, we had an initiative last summer as well, announced by our president. I don't think he used the word decolonize, but it was a call to each of us to think of, you know, how to, if you have courses that speak to the subject, and how can you have a course in American anything that does not, right? And again, the United States is not alone in this. I'm just saying, you know, Canada is going through its own, and for that matter, Australia, its own history of white settler colonialism and ideological reparations, intellectual acknowledgements, and what have you. But I wish, yes, I wish people would. I wish there would be a sort of market square. I hate it. Did I just say market? And where the content of the course is known in advance, and you can just see how lily white it is, if it is. But yeah, it's amazing how many people think that it's just their own concern and pull out the concern, stop at their classroom door.
Yeah, thank you for these comments. And we are running out of time, but I also believe this sort of discussion points to something that I wanted to raise but wasn't able to. But this is, I think, in line with what Butler's and Judith Butler's insistent on institutional definition of academic freedom as historically contingent, and that secured norms understood as outside of processes of change ignore the unstable nature of academic culture. And Butler points out that if we refuse to see that norms not only have a history that is still being made, but in fact must have one, that norms are revisable through time and in response to changing currents of thought, I think this goes right to what Nadje is saying, and inquiry, then we treat institutional norms as if they're fully accomplished. She says such a denial of the contestable character of norms, she warns, would mean that they would be essentially dead, frozen in time, and so too sadly would be the vocation of knowledge itself. And I think that brings us right back to the need to continuously have these kind of discussions of what is it that we as a community want to portray to the outside as well as to teach in our classrooms, and that there should be a communal conversation around curricular changes based on changing norms and changing knowledge production, that there's a flexibility, that we are not sitting in a silo that's stagnant. So with that, I would like to thank you all so very much for being here. I would like to thank our audience for joining us for this 30th anniversary of the lecture. A special thanks to Chandler for being here with us this evening, and being also part of many of the events that are going on outside of this particular lecture. So thank you so very much, and for your great wisdom that you've shared with us over the last few days. And of course, a great thanks to the panelists. It's been a wonderful occasion for me to meet you all and to have this discussion. And I hope and wish you all a lot of success in the work that you're doing. And yes, thank you so very much for being here.
Thank you.
Good to meet you all.
Thanks.
Thanks, Colleen.